In our Christian walk, when your heart really isn't in it, what should you do? Wait for feelings to catch up, fake it, or step forward by faith? Today we open Galatians to name the tension between what we know and what we feel. We will distinguish between hypocrisy from honest struggle and ask how to act in love without just playing a part. We will talk about confession, prayer, and the Spirit's help to close the gap between our head and our heart. So, Galatians, the title of the series is Rest, and there's been a lot of emphasis on resting in the gospel, letting the gospel be the motive of our growth in our lives, and not doing things for legalistic reasons, not doing things to earn the favor of God because you already have it. At the end of Galatians, there's the fruit of the Spirit, but there's just practically a lot of times in our lives when we're going through our Christian life and our Christian growth and we just don't feel it. And our emotions are not caught up to what maybe we think or know is true. So at what point does not feeling it cross over into hypocrisy?
Yeah, I think that depending on who's asking, there's a lot of people who, I would say this, there's a lot of people who tend to assume a certain, perhaps false definition of hypocrisy. I think a very simple way, and sometimes we just don't accept the simple definitions, but a very simple way of thinking about hypocrisy is just pretending to be something you're not. Just wearing a mask, aiming at, let's say, the approval of others, wanting to have a certain air about you or whatever, just pretending to be someone you are not. That is different from the person who acknowledges the difference between their head and their heart in certain situations and is saying, I'm going to step out in faith and I believe that this is what God's calling me to do and that gap will close a certain time. And there's going to be times where your heart is in it, but hey, there's certainly times where my heart isn't in it, those kinds of things. Hypocrisy is not the person wrestling with God about those things and being honest with themselves and confessing their sins and turning to the Lord time and time again and time again and time again when they don't feel like they're in it. I think hypocrisy is when, okay, you really don't care, but everyone thinks you sure do. You see, because you're not careful to be honest. You're being eaten up inside precisely because you've been apathetic, you've been indifferent, you don't care, and you feel crummy about that. And people ask you how you're doing, and no genuine answer ever comes out of your mouth. That's hypocrisy. And then carrying yourself in a way so that's not ever true. So I think a lot of those feelings, I know that for me, a lot of that was solved and really helped when I started to really embrace like the simplicity of wearing mask, just pretending. So it's more about motivation. Like hypocrisy, I think, is more about motivation than anything. And it's not just simply the gap between like your feelings and your actions.
I think that last point is really important. It's not simply the gap.
Right.
Like there's a lot of different ways we could talk about it, but it's not simply the gap between my feelings and my actions. I've heard people describe it as hypocrisy is pretending to be something you have no intention of being or no desire of being. So if you say, I really do, my intent, my desire is to be a God-honoring person who loves someone else. And right now at my core, I don't feel that love, but my intent is to be, my desire is to be, I want that. That's not hypocrisy. If you then say, I know this is a loving thing to do, I'm going to take the loving action. It's not ideal, but it's not hypocrisy.
That's right.
And I think that just recognizing what does hypocrisy mean. So pretending to be something you're not is one way to say it. I think sometimes we get caught up in that one though, because we say, but if I don't love from the very core of my being, then I'm not loving. So if I do an act of love, I must be pretending to be something I'm not. But to add that level, I'm pretending to be something I have no intention, no desire to be. Or one of the commentators I read said something like this, that hypocrisy was playing a role in a play where the gospel doesn't matter, to put it in Galatians specific language. Here Peter is saying, instead of the, if you will, the play of what church is doing, dramatizing the gospel and what God has done in forming this people, instead of actually acting in a consistent way with that story, he pulls himself away from the table, which communicates something totally different about the story of the gospel and the Gentiles. And that's where the word hypocrite comes from, an actor, in the sense that they would put a mask up, but they were in a play. So if you take that same metaphor, and sometimes I think just looking at it from different angles helps us, then he's playing a role as if he's in a different play, when in fact he does believe the gospel. Because it's not hypocrisy if Peter didn't believe the gospel, if he was just a Jew and he said, I'm not eating with Gentiles. That's not hypocrisy. It might be wrong. It's not hypocrisy.
Right.
So it's only hypocrisy because Peter says, I'm in this story and now I'm going to act somewhere else. And so I think one reason that we struggle with it is because we don't think through the implications of what we're doing. We don't think, am I really living consistently with the gospel?
One of the phrase that came to my mind is hypocrisy is not the same as immaturity per se. It's just not the same as immaturity. And sometimes we think we conflate that. We should be further along. This should not be the case, therefore hypocrisy.
And immaturity is the gap
That's right.
between my feelings and
That's
my
right.
actions. That's an immaturity
That's why I
thing.
bring that up.
Hypocrisy has to have some other element.
So towards the end of Galatians, it mentions the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, all those. And when I think fruit, I think of Psalms 1. It talks about the righteous man is like a tree planted by streams of water that yields its fruit in a season. Its leaf does not wither, and all that he does, he prospers. When I think of fruit, I think that does it not communicate that it should be automatic? It should just be natural that these things swell up inside of us. But again, our experience often is not like that. In a men's meeting the other night, someone used the example of sometimes it feels like you're stapling on the fruit of the Spirit. It's not growing, it's you're putting it on there. So at what point should we be concerned if we feel like we're having to force it?
I think that when we look at things like, let's just take love to use one specific fruit, so we aren't talking about all of them at once. But if we just take love, I think there are times when our heart response at our core, we know I don't just want to love that person more than I want my own selfishness right now. We know at the core there's times when that's the case. Now at that moment, what's the right thing for me to do? I'm about to speak to them. Should I speak harshly? I'm not going to be a hypocrite, so I'm not going to pretend to love. I would say no. I'd say we're called to say, God loved me. I'm to love them. I should speak in a loving way. Here's the part that I think we should do, though. We should never be satisfied with that. Like, we should never think, I said the right loving thing, so we pat ourselves on the back, even though we know our heart wasn't there. No, we should be brokenhearted before God over that. We should be contrite, repentant, to say, God, yes, by your grace, you reminded me that I shouldn't say that thing I really wanted to say, and you empowered me to instead think of something that was loving to say. Thank you for that. But God, work in my heart, change that, bring me to maturity, match the feelings to the actions in that way. Like, it's never, sometimes we get this weird sense that we think backwards. We think like doing something loving is somehow the sinful thing. Like, it's not sinful to do something loving, even if you don't feel it to your core, but not feeling it at your heart is sinful still, even if you do the loving thing. I think that, to me, is the thing we have to keep backing up to. You can't measure your morality based on the external standard alone. Jesus drives us to that all the time. So you could say, I said all the loving things, but my heart was full of hate. And Jesus says, the heart full of hate was still sinful. That doesn't mean the loving things you said were sinful. It means the heart behind them was sinful. So act in love, pursue joy, pursue peace, pursue patience. We are to pursue those things. But when we know, we examine, like, God, my heart isn't where it should be. God, forgive me and change that heart. Don't be satisfied with merely the external performance.
Yeah, one of the things I think when I hear the language of force, or like forcing it, I think of, in particular in relation to the Spirit in Galatians chapter 5, which you pointed out, is the fact that before Paul talks about the fruit of the Spirit, he talked about the flesh. And not just its fruit, but its desires. And I think that we forget what precedes that passage, beginning in verse 16. But I say to you, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. For the desires of the flesh are against the Spirit, and the desires of the Spirit are against the flesh, for these are opposed to each other to keep you from doing the things that you want to do. But if you are led by the Spirit, you're not under the law, for the works of the flesh are evident, etc. We want to read that as if you're being led by the Spirit. The desires of the flesh are non-existent. The attitudes, the posture, that's not what it says. It says that you won't follow them, but it doesn't say that they never pop up. That the thing that we should be opposing, these desires, are vacant or non-existent. I'll read it again, but I said you walk by the Spirit and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. That actually presupposes the opposite, that there will be there. And this is why we long to be glorified. This is why we long to be fully like Christ. In other words, even its growth here in fruit bearing is situated in the context of Galatians 5 over and against not just the flesh in general as such, but even against the desires of the flesh. But here's the thing. Where do the desires of the flesh exist? Not externally to you, internally to you. Those are your desires. Those are desires of your flesh. Not just some random thing out there in the world called flesh that that's just out there, some power that has nothing to do with you. It's desires of your flesh. And this is why he says, I say to you, if you walk by the Spirit, you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. That's helped me a lot, because those moments I'm drawn in this or that direction where I feel like I have to have effort. That's actually, I should expect that according to Scripture. It's not bearing the fruit of the Spirit by the Spirit via without any opposition. That's happening in the face of the opposition of very real desires that I have. They're mine, called desires of the flesh. And that is the context that comes before you get the fruit of the Spirit and those kinds of things. It's the same thing in Romans chapter 8, where he says that if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. He assumes that they're deeds of the body. Same thing in Romans chapter 6, where you're to present your members to righteousness and these kinds of things. But it takes effort, reckoning yourself to be dead to sin and alive to God through our Lord Jesus Christ. So the Spirit's powerful and mighty work is never presented as just passively flowing through us. The same Paul who wrote in 1:6, he who began a good work in you, Philippians 1:6, will bring it to completion at the day of Christ Jesus, follows that up in Philippians chapter 2. Just as you've always obeyed in my presence, so much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Why? Because God is at work in you, both to will and to do of his good pleasure. So it's not presented as, well, the Spirit's there, and if you abide, we assume a passivity in that abiding, in that rest. It takes work. It's an active thing. And if it's you put to death, if you walk by the Spirit, you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. So I found that completely liberating, because it's promised, and the power and the energy that is required is not at all of me. It's all of grace, but what's of grace? What is fruit? Because in the fruit is the fruit of what? One of them is what? Self-control. Self-control. It all presupposes an overcoming of these things that are at work in us, against our soul, sure, against the Spirit, yes, but that's very important. I think some of those things are overlooked in discussions.
Yeah, and I think we'll get to it later in the sermon series, but if you look even right before that, he says, don't use your freedom as opportunity for the flesh, but instead use your freedom to serve one another. So there's going to be times when you have freedom of the soul because of your rest in the gospel, because of the power of the Spirit, which Paul connects justification in the Spirit all the time throughout this. So because of your rest in the gospel, your approval through Christ only, you have freedom. So use it to serve one another. There's going to be moments, then using his language, there's going to be moments where I have freedom to serve by saying a kind and loving word, but I feel internally a desire of the flesh that right then doesn't match the act I want to take, the act I say, I really should show this love. I want to have freedom, and it is not wrong. In fact, it's very right to then, by resting in the gospel, speak the kind and loving word that is bearing fruit of the Spirit, which is where that rest in the gospel comes from, over against the desire that is very real and very internal. So there is that sense. So to put that in the other side then, back to wait, so if that's not hypocrisy, what is it? In that same language, That same language would be to say, I'm not resting in the truth of the gospel, really. I don't really feel the freedom of my soul to do this. In fact, I don't want to serve others and have no intention, really. I'm going to, for some other reason, play this loving external action, pat myself on the back that my performance is okay, and I've really just completely nullified grace. That's hypocrisy, not a difference between your desire and your godly action. Of course, that's not hypocrisy. So trying to learn to identify that in our lives, I think that's the challenge.
And I wonder sometimes the way we feel desire. I think we also assume that we feel desire in a certain kind of way. What I mean to say is, why are we choosing the godly thing? Because we have a desire to do the godly thing. But we're more aware of our ungodly desire. And I do think that even feelings, we can be unaware sometimes of what's really going on with our own souls. And that's what I mean to say, just bringing that up. Because if you are pursuing righteousness and you're aware of that, the fact that entails the heart and not just the action, and that's what you're wanting, like you said, the intentions, and you do it, but you're worried about hypocrisy in the midst of it. Realistically, one of the things I would say in a more practical level, if I was sitting across the table from someone, is I would probably say something like, brother or sister, I think you actually have even more godly desires than you realize on top of it.
I think it's important to separate your emotion from your spirit and your thinking, because just because you feel something, it does not mean that's what's truly happening in your spirit. And as we were talking, I was looking up the testimony of Corrie ten Boom, and she is a well-known story, but she was in a World War II concentration camp, got out, she was a Christian, years later met a guard who asked her for forgiveness. And her testimony, she said, and still I stood there with a coldness clutching my heart. But forgiveness is not an emotion. I knew that too. Forgiveness is an act of the will, and the will can function regardless of the temperature of the heart. Jesus, help me. I prayed silently. I can lift my hand. I can do that much. You supply the feeling. So in that moment, she's feeling coldness. Her feeling is not what we would say the feeling of forgiveness. But through the Spirit, she had the strength to go ahead, and she asked to lift my hand. And then she says, and so woodenly, mechanically, I thrust my hand into the one stretched out to me. And as I did, an incredible thing took place. The current started in my shoulder, raced down my arm, sprang into our joined hands, and then this feeling of warmth seemed to flood my whole being, bringing tears to my eyes. I forgive you, brother, I cried with all my heart. And it's through the Spirit moving, not through her emotions, but through the Spirit moving into her decision-making of, yes, I will forgive this person, that then the emotions came, and she felt it. So there's a separation of our spirit and living in the Spirit from our emotions. Yeah, it's great if our whole being, including our emotions, comes together. And that there are moments and times that when that comes, but then there's sometimes when the emotions are separate from that. And that doesn't mean you're living necessarily wrongfully or in hypocrisy, but that God's, and yeah, I think, yeah, you should pay attention to when you feel that, but then it's what's the next right thing. And if your heart is, I'm going to do the next right thing, even though I don't feel it, that can be the Spirit moving in you as well. Thank you for listening. Next time we face a common fear, God won't bless me because I fell short. Is that how God really acts towards us? We will look at grace, preparation, and why results are not a scoreboard for worthiness.